D. It's known as rejection sensitivity disorder. I never heard that before, and a client came in and said, "Hey, what do you know about this?" And I was like, "I don't. Tell me more about it." And I find it interesting, right? It's not a DSM-5 diagnosis. It's not, but it is something that people are dealing with. So I cannot diagnose you with it. But it relates on a lot of levels to a lot of things that humans are dealing with. So specifically, if you look up RSD, it's associated with neurodivergence, so ADHD or autism spectrum disorder. A lot of times when people, and especially young people, have learned to be othered, as seen as other, they tend to really have a sensitivity to feeling othered, right? Or rejected. And it's not specific to those things, but that's the association a lot of times. And so when as the client was describing it to me, and then I went and did my own research, I was looking at this idea that a lot of times when we are othered or seen as wrong, bad, or other, we have this awareness that something is wrong with how we present in the world. And when you have, ADHD or autism spectrum disorder, a lot of times people see you as not typical. And then you start to other yourself, right? You start to feel like something is wrong with me. Like I am not normal, like other people. And consequently, I will be rejected or not not part of the group, right? Not part of the larger whole. And I thought that was really interesting. So as my client was talking about it, I was like, okay, well, there's a couple things here. One, is that true all the time, especially in your adult life? And as we were talking about it, what I was helping him to see is that he's not othered, right? But when we have that perspective that we will be rejected or seen as other, we start to overthink things in our head. And a lot of times it will affect our behavior, specific to how we interact with other humans, and certainly humans that we want the approval of, or we want to be part of that group, right? And he was like, I do recognize that I, in the past, have been conflict avoidant or will try to accommodate a lot of different perspectives because I don't want people to leave me, right? Basically abandon me. And it had me thinking about, like attachment style, and certainly anxious or avoidant attachment is, when we either feel really anxious, we want to attach to other people and we want to feel part of the group or accepted. But if our fear or anxiety says people are going to reject us, they're not going to like us for whatever reason, then we can be a lot more people pleasy or, accommodating to other people's interactions because of that fear. So there's that piece, the attachment piece, right? Anxious or avoidant attachers are going to be like, I don't want to attach to anyone. I'm going to keep this very casual and I'm not going to invest a lot because I am afraid that people will leave me. I will be abandoned. So I will either avoid it and have, casual relationships or not, tied down to one thing, because if I invest a lot in one human, then I could be abandoned and feel really sad and overwhelmed. An anxious attacher will attach very quickly, but will also hold on to this fear that I will be abandoned. Like something will happen. You're going to see the real me. I will mess this up somehow. And so I'm always afraid that I will be abandoned or rejected. So that's how it affects, attachment style. Specific to codependency, if we are so used to doing for others in the hopes that we will be accepted, validated, and loved, then if I'm often fearful that I will be rejected and or abandoned, I will do anything to keep that relationship going, right? I will, do extra stuff. I will sacrifice my own needs. I will be focused on the other person and putting on, my representative rather than being my whole full self, because there's that fear that if I am my whole full self, I will be rejected, all of my parts at the same time. And so you only get to see one or two parts of me. and you don't get to see the whole thing because I have that fear, right? That sensitivity to feeling rejected or not being good enough or being somehow wrong, bad, or other. And as it relates to, neurodivergence, it's interesting because when I have talked to, especially lots of adults lately, have started to recognize that they have found workarounds to their ADHD. A lot of them have either been not diagnosed or misdiagnosed, and unfortunately have not been able to get the help either with medication to help their brain regulate or with tools and skills to be able to work through things. They've just been able to work around it. And a lot of times, because there's an impulse control part of it, they'll just say things, right? And so a lot of times they'll be viewed as people who are rude, which is not true. They're actually just, they can't employ the filter fast enough because they don't have, their brain works so fast that they're just saying things, and they'll tell the truth a lot of the time. So people know where they stand with people who have neurodivergence because they don't have a filter. Or they may have a filter, they just don't use it all the time. And certainly in certain environments, they have been able to find those workarounds to either pause or, limit what they say. A lot of times they're going to be introverts. They're not going to be super outgoing because of that fear that they will be othered, that they will be seen as, oh my God, they just say whatever, or they're always interrupting or whatever. They tend to learn how to manage themselves by not interacting. And so you get a very clean and sanitized version of them, and they appear to be kind of aloof or not engaging or whatever it is, when really they've learned how to shut that down and to manage what they say by overcorrecting and not interjecting, right? And it's really difficult when you think about someone who has often been misinterpreted or misunderstood. And so you don't get to see their full self and the people that are closest to them. So a lot of times partners who have, someone in their life who is ADHD or neurodivergent, they will be their whole selves because they've held it in, held it really tight and locked it down in a work environment or a school environment because they don't want to feel wrong, bad, or other. And it was interesting to me to really recognize with this client, I was like, okay, are there people in your experience that can accept who you are and do validate that you have really good ideas, or that the way that you do your job or whatever responsibility you have, that you do it well? He was like thinking about it, and he was like, yeah. I'm like, it comes down to trust. So trusting the other person values what you add to a situation, but also trusting yourself, right? Really recognizing, I trust me, I am good at these things. I talk often about being good at life, and life is complicated and difficult, so not all of us are good at it all the time, but most of us have learned how to follow the protocols for doing life in such a way that we have successes. You're not always successful, but you have successes or wins in life, right? When you're young and in your 20s or whatever, I tell you, 20s are for messing up. That's where you start to learn how to engage in the world in a way, and there's got to be lots and lots of failure, right? But at certain points in our life, especially when we go through difficult and challenging things, we have to start over. We have to rebuild and start to integrate new tools to be able to be successful or to find and have successes, right? And like I said, sometimes people will shut down completely in certain environments because they don't either trust that they will be able to handle it or behave in a way that's appropriate, or they have learned that they will be rejected. And that's where that sensitivity starts to build up, right? In relationships, and certainly in cohabitated, long-term situations, learning how to be your full self and trust that you will be accepted takes time and effort. It also takes communication. But the first part is trusting yourself to be able to get through and work on those things. It's curious to me when, we show up as our representative, we give somebody the beautiful, glossy version of who we are. And then as we learn more about them and learn more about ourselves in that relationship dynamic, either we are going to become more comfortable with our full selves, or then we start to cut parts of ourselves off. We start to get in that box of expectation. And it's one of those opportunities to start to pay attention to the relationships that you have around you, and certainly the dynamics in which you have to be a certain version of yourself in those spaces. I'm grateful to have lots of different people around me of different generations, of different awarenesses and learnings, because I learned then more about myself in those interactions. And I was having an interesting conversation with my mother, and I had shared a picture with her and she made some comments about it. And I was like, actually, one of the cool things that my daughter has taught me is not to comment on people's bodies. One, because it's not really kind. And also it is situational and circumstantial to the situation that they're in, right? And so she was like, well, I was just observing, and I've told you guys before, Margarita has lots of questions. That's how she interacts with the world. She just is very curious and she asks a lot of questions. As her kids, we can get overwhelmed with that and be like, whoa. She will ask very obvious questions like, is that so-and-so? Or what do you think they're building there? And I have learned to be like, that's a really good question for the planning committee of the city. I don't know. I am observing the same thing you're observing, right? Sometimes we can guess or postulate about what is happening, but for the most part, it can be overwhelming to have those kinds of questions because I don't know the answer. But specific to people's bodies, her generation would make lots and lots of comments about how people looked. And that is kind of typical for older people in their 70s. But I'm learning that that's not really helpful, right? Especially because we have such a huge epidemic of people overly consumed with how they look to the point that they are hurting themselves, which is not really helpful. And so in that conversation, I was just like, Luna has taught me not to talk about people's bodies. And so that's a weird question and I don't know the answer, right? Or whatever. But when we start to think about how we are fearful that we will be rejected or othered, it does create this level of sensitivity to being, observed and then criticized for how we look, how we talk, how we behave, what is happening. And so a lot of times we will package ourselves in a way that is palatable for the masses. And then we are not showing or comfortable with our authentic self. If we can get to a place where we can trust and like who we are and how we show up in the world, then we are less sensitive to that idea of being rejected. And, when I'm talking to clients a lot of times, it's like, you have to think about the rooms and the spaces and the people that are rejecting you. Is that a group you want to be part of? Because if they are talking about people's bodies or often being critical or negative, is that a group you want to be associated with, right? And when you can trust and really like yourself, changing how you talk about yourself, what you start to do is trusting that the right people are going to like you and the rest of the people doesn't really matter. We are so overwhelmed and inundated with images and, the way that people perceive us, that a lot of times we are overwhelmed by how we are perceived. Consequently, we are trying to work really hard to be the best version of ourselves, either in those spaces and not really showing our authentic self. When we can think about what our goal is in interacting with people, and when we are at that place and level of comfort with ourselves, right, we can be really conscious and conscientious of how we interact with people. Not overly so to the point where we're anxious, but really aware of what what our goal is in that interaction, right? I have a presentation coming up in January, and I've given the presentation a bunch of times, but I haven't given it on video. So this will be a Zoom presentation. And I'm getting a little bit anxious of like, how's that going to come across? Even though I've been doing videos, certainly for the podcast, what is that going to look like to give a presentation? So normally I'm a very dynamic presenter. And so I like to walk around the room and I move my hands and do all the things. Well, I'm going to have to do it sitting down. And so being aware of that, right? Being very aware of like what that's going to look like with slides and those kinds of things. And so I'm starting to really think about it without trying to get anxious about it, because I do recognize that in this room of other therapists that have signed up for this presentation, I want to come across as someone who knows what they're talking about, as well as not looking too erratic, because sometimes I can be erratic in a presentation kind of way. When I'm walking around the room, it does move my energy around, which is why I feel a lot more successful and am able to engage with a crowd, because I'm walking around, I'm talking about things. I had to attach a microphone to myself last time because I was talking in a ballroom, and then that felt too much. And so I can project my voice really well. And so really thinking about what's going to work best, right? In a podcast situation, it's just me talking to a camera, and I feel really comfortable that way. But then to be able to monitor like how people are engaging and all the things. The reason I'm bringing that up is because I think about how I can be perceived. I'm very conscious and conscientious of how I am able to present the information. The information is the most important thing. Me, not so much. But how I present it is going to be important, right? Being able to project my voice, being able to enunciate my words, being funny and silly the way that I am, but without like feeling overwhelmed or too erratic. These are all things that I'm paying attention to, right? And recognizing that I'm also just a human being who's saying words in a situation, and trusting that I know what I'm talking about and that this room of humans will also kind of get something from it, and they'll be able to ask questions. And so it's one of those things to pay attention to. Once you are confident and comfortable and securely attached to you, you can have a good interaction with people and be able to walk away without that fear that they are going to reject you or they are not going to like you. You are not supposed to be liked by everyone, right? There are always going to be people who you don't align with, and that's okay. But when you can get to that place of trusting yourself, securely attached to you, knowing that like your needs and values and words are important, then it's okay if other people reject you. It's okay if other people don't like you, because other people are having their own experience that really isn't about you, right? And we talk about this idea of like, you're not for everyone, or not everyone has to like you, because when everyone likes you, that means that you've accommodated a lot of other perspectives without really recognizing what your worth and value is. You're not securely attached to that. And that's the part that I work with clients often, because when I know and when they know that they are securely attached to themselves, when they really like who they are and how they show up, then they will be more authentic, and they will actually attract the people in their experience that genuinely like them for who they are and not for what they do. So if you've heard of RSD before, hopefully that gives you a little bit more perspective. If you haven't heard of it, you're welcome to look it up and kind of see what that is. But I thought it was interesting that it's labeled a disorder because it's not disordered thinking, right? It is disordered or not helpful when we feel so overwhelmed by that feeling that we will be rejected or seen as other. And certainly in the society that we live in, it feels as though we are often scrutinized or perceived and then categorized into you're my people or you're not my people. I don't want to be everybody's people, right? I am grateful when people align with or can get something from this experience, like listening to my, podcast or watching my videos or coming and, being a client. but I'm not supposed to be for everyone. And like I've said often, there are lots of great therapists out there. Please go find your flavor, your brand, the one that aligns with you so that you can do your healing, but I'm not supposed to be for everyone, right? And I'm grateful, like I said, for the people who get something from this experience and then can take it and integrate it into their lives. Like that's the goal, not to be for everyone. It's interesting. I was thinking about like our early podcast episodes, and Kat and I were like, oh my God, we want to be like Joe Rogan. No, we don't. At the time, that felt really good. Like, because it was such a huge podcast in this like burgeoning new experience to talk, just out loud and have, conversations. The way that I've been able to be successful at this is by continuing to put out product and learning and thinking about it, right? And having conversations with other people with different perspectives that aren't always my own, right? And when we think about this idea of like specific to neurodivergent humans, they spend a lot of time in their brain perceiving, how do I be normal, right? Normal is a word that I've gotten away from using because I prefer typical. It's a lot more broad and it's kind of encompassing a lot of different, experiences, whatever. But when someone feels as though they are going to be othered outside of the norm or outside of what is typical, that feels uncomfortable because a lot of times they have been rejected or seen as negative, wrong, bad, or other. And so when that fear comes up or that sensitivity to being rejected, aka abandoned, presents itself, it can feel really uncomfortable and overwhelming. And consequently, it has been labeled a disorder. It's not, like I said, in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for identifying problematic behavior, but it is out there as just part of the lexicon. And it's interesting because, thinking about these things, people are spending a lot of time talking to AI about stuff. And I have very significant feelings about that. It's interesting because it's one perspective and it's generated from a lot of different perspectives as AI continues to learn. But having conversations with people, human beings with different perspectives is actually how we're going to learn more things. This is a caution to using AI as a therapist or as, one other entity or experience in that echo chamber is that it's a computer. It doesn't actually know anything other than what it is fed. And as we continue to live on a planet with a ton of people, and the fear is that we will be rejected by people, AI won't reject you. It just, tells you from its learning experience what you want to hear because you're only asking it what you want to understand, right? Having a conversation with other humans is how we actually get a more nuanced perspective. And I have had so many clients, they're talking to Gemini, they're talking to Clark, they're talking to, ChatGPT. And again, it's a tool, it's helpful to give you information in a general way, but it's actually important to talk to other humans. They could reject you, absolutely. But you will find your people the more authentic you are. And AI will actually learn more about humans and the human experience. The more authentic you are, the more vulnerable. So that's just my little plug on the fear that like AI is going to take over my job. It's not. It might, right? The idea or the lore is that therapy is inaccessible. And for some people, that's true. As therapists continue to charge so much money, I don't want to make $1 million. What I want to do is to help contribute to a society that is kinder and more aware and more authentic. So there's your nugget. I did post a bunch of videos last week, especially the ones that don't have the audio for the podcast. So go to the YouTube. It's LX2 COD coaching. It's for the podcast. And so LX2 Codependency Coaching Podcast. My book is available if you want to get a copy of it. You can get a copy from me. You can just email me and I will send you a copy, charge you money, like it's a whole thing. You can go to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, the publisher directly. There's a bunch of links on my website, which is luna-x2-llc.com. Anyway, there's your nugget. I hope to give you another podcast next week. If you have any questions, you can get a hold of me at lx2.cod.coach@gmail.com, and I will talk to you soon. Take care.